in the heat of the Middle Eastern sun. Tensions were simmering beneath the surface like dry brush, waiting for a spark. It was the mid-1960s, and the fragile peace that had tenuously held since the bloody battles of 1948 was beginning to crack. At the heart of the new conflict was something deceptively simple: water. The Sea of Galilee, a shimmering blue gem in northern Israel, became a flashpoint in a war that would reshape the map of the region in less than a week. Syria, perched high on the Golan Heights, watched Israel's growing reliance on the Sea of Galilee with suspicion. Streams from Syrian-controlled territory fed into the sea, which Israel had begun tapping to sustain its population and irrigate the Negev desert. For Syria, this was more than a resource dispute. It was a provocation. In a bold move, Syrian engineers began digging a canal to divert the tributaries of the Jordan River away from Israeli territory. It was an act of economic warfare cloaked as civil engineering, and it pushed Israel closer to a line it had vowed never to cross again, another existential war. But water was only the spark. The fuel for war had been gathering for years, decades even. When the United Nations voted in 1947 to partition, British-controlled Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, the Arab world reacted with rage. Palestinians rejected the plan. Neighboring Arab nations vowed to crush the fledgling Jewish state. The 1948 Arab-Israeli war that followed left the region shattered and deeply divided, with millions of refugees, smoldering hatreds, and uneasy ceasefires drawn along jagged, fragile lines. In the years that followed, border clashes became routine. Artillery shells whistled across the frontiers. Guerrilla raids spilled blood in quiet villages. The rhetoric from Cairo, Damascus, and Amman grew more venomous with each passing month. Arab leaders, jockeying for dominance in the region, began to view open war with Israel not just as a necessity but as a political weapon to rally their fractured nations. Behind the scenes, alliances were shifting. Egypt's charismatic president Gamal Abdel Nasser, once the hero of pan-Arabism, saw his influence waning. Syria's Ba'athist regime was rapidly gaining favor among the Arab masses by taking a hardline stance against Israel. Nasser could not afford to be outdone. He began massing troops in the Sinai Peninsula. He expelled UN peacekeepers. He closed the Straits of Tiran, Israel's crucial lifeline to the Red Sea. From the outside, Israel looked vulnerable, small, narrow, and surrounded by hostile neighbors. But within, the Israeli Defense Forces had been preparing for this very moment. Their plans were precise, their intelligence deadly accurate, their mindset one of survival. They knew one thing for certain: if war came again, they would strike first, and strike hard. The countdown had begun. In the shadows of diplomacy, armies moved. In the silence before the storm, pilots trained and tanks refueled. And in just 6 days, the Middle East would change forever. Israel was born into fire, a state declared amid chaos, surrounded by enemies, and carved from land that had long been contested by blood and belief. But even after surviving its dramatic birth in 1948 and fighting off a coalition of Arab armies determined to strangle it in the cradle, the young nation found itself in a perilous position. Just look at the map, a narrow sliver of land hugging the Mediterranean, just 15 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The country's geography was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Surrounded by hostile neighbors on all sides, Israel lacked what military strategists call strategic depth. There was no buffer, no fallback zone. If war came and enemies breached the border, there would be nothing between invading tanks and Israel's population centers. This was not just a theoretical concern. In the north, Syria's artillery positions on the Golan Heights had clear lines of fire into Israel's valleys, where children went to school and farmers plowed fields under the threat of constant bombardment. To the east, Jordan's army sat atop the Judean Hills, watching down over Tel Aviv and the narrow corridor that connected northern and southern Israel. And in the south, the Egyptian military, with its vast manpower and Soviet-supplied arsenal, loomed across the Sinai Peninsula. Every border, every direction spelled potential disaster. Now imagine trying to defend a nation like that. You could not rely on attrition, not when your population was a fraction of your enemies, and your economy could not sustain long wars. You could not afford to wait for your enemies to strike first, either, because the first blow could be the last. So Israel embraced a different philosophy: strike first, strike fast, and finish the war before it ever truly begins. Preemptive warfare was not just doctrine, it was necessity. This was not bravado. It was calculated survival. Israel's leaders understood that they would never win by matching their enemies, soldier for soldier, tank for tank. Instead, they focused on speed, intelligence, precision, and above all, maneuverability. They did not build their military to hold the line, they built it to move fast. The Israeli Air Force trained obsessively on rapid turnaround times. Mechanics practiced refueling and rearming jets in under 8 minutes. Pilots drilled complex missions over and over, not just to fly, but to fly like ghosts, undetected and deadly. Every part of the military was designed with one mission in mind. If a storm came, Israel would not wait to be struck. It would become the storm. So when the signs of war grew impossible to ignore, in May of 1967, when Egyptian troops massed in the Sinai, when Syria stepped up its artillery fire from the Golan Heights, when King Hussein of Jordan was dragged into a military pact with Egypt, Israel knew what had to be done. But this was not a decision made lightly. Inside the Israeli cabinet, there were fierce debates between those who still hoped for a diplomatic solution and those who believed war was already inevitable. The tipping point came when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israel's access to the Red Sea. It was an act of war under international law, and it left no room for interpretation. On June 5, 1967, at 7:45 a.m. Israeli time, the sky above Cairo was quiet. Egyptian pilots had completed their dawn patrols and returned to base, unaware that their brief moment of rest was about to cost them everything. At 8:45 a.m., a wave of Israeli jets streaked toward their targets at low altitude, using the curvature of the earth to mask their approach. In just a few hours, the Egyptian Air Force, one of the largest and best equipped in the Arab world, was reduced to smoldering wreckage. Aircraft destroyed on the ground, runways cratered, hangars torn apart. Israel did not just attack, it annihilated. And then, without pause, those same jets turned north and east toward Jordan and Syria. By noon on the first day of the war, Israel had complete air superiority over 3 enemy nations. From that moment on, Israeli ground forces could move without fear of enemy aircraft. It was the linchpin of the entire war plan. But air superiority alone was not enough. The ground war was just beginning, and now the Israeli Defense Forces put their strategy of maneuver into action. Tanks surged across the Sinai in 3 main thrusts, bypassing Egyptian strongholds and collapsing their defenses from behind. In Jerusalem, paratroopers stormed fortified Jordanian positions, inching through trenches and alleys to reach the Old City. In the north, Israeli forces braced for the most difficult challenge of all, the Golan Heights, where Syrian troops sat dug into concrete bunkers atop cliffs, with machine guns zeroed in on every approach. These were not easy victories. At places like Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem and Telephone Feher in the Golan, Israeli soldiers faced withering fire, complex terrain, and fierce resistance. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand. But the Israeli strategy remained consistent: move fast, strike hard, and never allow the enemy time to regroup. Within 6 days, Israel had routed 3 Arab armies, seized vast swaths of territory, and flipped the regional balance of power on its head. But with victory came new dilemmas. Israel now held the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. For the first time in its history, Israel had what it had always lacked: strategic depth. It had buffers, defensive positions, and the ability to trade land for peace. But those same gains also brought occupation, controversy, and conflict that would last for decades. The victories of 1967 did not end the war for Israel. They just started a new chapter. Still, the Six-Day War proved something fundamental. For a nation with narrow borders, few natural defenses, and a constant sense of siege, survival would always depend on clarity of purpose, unity of action, and the courage to act before it was too late. The war did not just reshape geography, it reshaped Israel's identity. From the airstrikes that lit up Egyptian runways to the flag raised over the Western Wall, every moment told a single story, a story of a nation that refused to wait for death at its doorstep. In the simmering heat of May 1967, the Middle East was a tinderbox, but no one knew how close the match was to striking. For weeks, the tension had built like a rising storm. Syrian shelling from the Golan Heights intensified, border skirmishes flared with Jordan, and Egyptian radio broadcasts dripped with the language of impending war. Israel, surrounded and constantly alert, watched with growing unease as events spiraled beyond rhetoric. But it was President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt who took the decisive step one that would seal the path to war and change the region forever. It began with a phone call and a demand. Nasser, asserting Egypt's newfound confidence after years of military buildup and with Soviet backing, ordered the United Nations peacekeeping force out of the Sinai Peninsula. These peacekeepers, stationed there since the end of the 1956 Suez Crisis, were meant to serve as a buffer between Egyptian and Israeli forces. Their presence had maintained an uneasy calm, a kind of artificial breathing space that prevented sudden eruptions of violence. Yet in one bold move, Nasser shattered that equilibrium. The UN forces, lacking a mandate to resist, packed their bags and withdrew. Almost overnight, Egyptian troops flooded into the Sinai. Tank divisions rolled across the desert, artillery was positioned near the Israeli border, and the Egyptian Air Force took up forward bases within striking distance of Tel Aviv. But it did not end there. On May 22nd, Nasser announced that the Straits of Tiran, Israel's maritime lifeline to Asia and Africa, were closed to Israeli shipping. The announcement was delivered with fanfare, pride, and an air of finality. To the world, it was a statement of Arab defiance. To Israel, it was something far more serious. International law was clear. The closure of the Straits of Tiran was an act of war. The straits were a vital artery for Israel's trade in oil supplies, especially after the Suez Canal had become a hostile route. Denying access was not merely economic sabotage, it was a strategic noose. For a country as geographically vulnerable as Israel, this was not a situation it could afford to tolerate. The countdown had begun, and every Israeli leader knew it. Inside Israel's war rooms, the atmosphere turned electric. Maps of the Sinai and Golan were spread across tables. Intelligence reports from Mossad and military reconnaissance poured in. The pressure was immense, not only from the Egyptian threat, but from the unknowns. Would Jordan join the fight? Would Syria launch a simultaneous offensive? Were the Soviets pushing Nasser behind? The scenes. And most terrifying of all, what would happen if Israel waited? For Israel, delay meant death. The country could not afford to absorb the first blow, not when Egyptian forces were massed and growing stronger by the hour. Israel's doctrine, shaped by necessity, had always emphasized speed, initiative, and overwhelming force. Now those principles would be tested on a scale unlike anything before. There would be no second chances. Either Israel struck first and seized the initiative, or it would find itself fighting on multiple fronts, outnumbered and surrounded. Still, the decision was not made lightly. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was cautious, hoping for international intervention. But the international community was silent. The United States urged restraint but offered no guarantees. The United Nations had already backed away. Even France, once Israel's closest ally, remained neutral, alone, isolated. And with its lifeline to the Red Sea cut, Israel faced the reality that diplomacy had reached its limit. On the streets of Tel Aviv, air raid sirens howled in the night as civilians dug trenches and sealed windows with masking tape. Gas masks were distributed, schools were closed, hospitals prepared for mass casualties. In kibbutzim near the borders, families rehearsed evacuation drills. Israel braced for war not out of choice but out of certainty. And yet, amid the tension, there was also a steely calm, a resolve born of history and hardship. The memory of the Holocaust still lingered in every household. The fear of annihilation was not abstract, it was personal. And the Israeli people, from generals to farmers, knew they had no margin for error. If war came, it would have to be won decisively and swiftly. So when Israeli intelligence confirmed that Egyptian forces were finalizing their battle plans, the Israeli cabinet made its fateful choice. The order was given for Operation Focus, an all-out preemptive airstrike designed to decapitate the Egyptian Air Force before it could leave the ground. The IDF, fueled by weeks of preparation, snapped into action with terrifying precision. But at the heart of it all, the movement of tanks, the roar of jets, the calculus of survival was the moment Nasser blocked the Straits of Tiran. That single act, framed by many as bravado or defiance, was in fact the turning point. It unified Israeli opinion across all political factions. It signaled, unmistakably, that war was no longer hypothetical. It was here, it was now. By forcing Israel into a corner, Egypt had triggered a chain reaction. What followed was not just a war of territory or tactics, but a war of existence. The Six-Day War, which erupted only days after the blockade, would redraw the map, change the power dynamics of the Middle East, and leave a legacy that endures to this day. But it all began in May 1967, when a president thought he could choke a nation into submission only to awaken a storm instead. Dawn broke over the Middle East on June 5, 1967, as a veil of silence hung over the skies. But in Israel, that silence was deceptive. Beneath it, jet engines whispered in revving tones. Airfields buzzed with final checks, and pilots tightened their harnesses in cockpits stained with anticipation. At precisely 7:45 a.m., the first wave of Israeli jets rose from the desert floor, not toward defense, but with a singular mission. Strike first, strike hard, and never let the enemy recover. This was Operation Focus. For weeks, Israel had prepared for this moment. Every hour of intelligence gathering, every aerial simulation, every satellite photograph had been funneled into what would become one of the most meticulously planned air assaults in military history. Egypt, swollen with confidence and backed by Soviet arms, had concentrated nearly its entire air force along the Sinai on runways fully exposed and tragically unguarded from the skies. The Israeli jets, Mirages, Supermysters, and Oregons flew low over the Mediterranean, hugging the earth to avoid radar detection. They vanished beneath Egypt's surveillance net, not in squadrons, but in staggered precision waves. Then, in a matter of minutes, they struck. Runway after runway was cratered, trapping Egyptian planes on the ground. Hardened aircraft shelters did not exist. Control towers vanished in fireballs, and as hangars exploded, the Egyptian Air Force, the largest in the Arab world, was being systematically erased before a single plane could take flight. In under 3 hours, over 250 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed. MiG-21s, Sukhoi 7s, Ilyushin bombers, all reduced to smoldering wrecks on blackened tarmac. Air bases like Inchaz, Cairo West, and Beni Suef were transformed into graveyards of twisted metal. The Egyptian pilots, some sprinting toward their cockpits, never got the chance to launch. Communications were cut. Command structures crumbled. The sky, once poised to blanket Israel in fire, was eerily empty. But Israel did not stop there. While Egyptian generals scrambled for answers and confusion rippled through Arab command networks, the Israeli Air Force turned its focus east and north. Jordan had begun shelling West Jerusalem, emboldened by false reports from Cairo that Tel Aviv was burning and Egypt was advancing. Syria launched artillery strikes into Galilee. Iraq, sensing opportunity, emitted aircraft to the fight. Israel responded not with panic, but with ruthless efficiency. In successive waves, IAF jets struck Jordanian airfields at Mafraq and Amman, obliterating Hawker hunters and destroying radar installations. Syrian runways at Damascus and Dumir fell under the same storm. Iraqi bases near H3 and H4 deep in the western desert were hammered despite the logistical challenge. Showcasing the far-reaching arm of Israeli planning, each strike was coordinated to follow the same pattern, cratering runways first to trap aircraft, then targeting parked jets, fuel storage, and air control facilities. By nightfall on the first day of war, Israel had achieved what few militaries dared to dream: total air superiority over 3 national air forces, and near parity against a 4th. It was a victory of not just technology, but doctrine. Israel's preemptive strike was not born from arrogance, but necessity. The country could not survive a prolonged war on 3 fronts, nor could it absorb simultaneous aerial bombardments from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. The plan was not just to survive, but to disarm the enemy's greatest threat before the first bullet was fired, on the ground. And now, with the skies above Israel clear, the ground campaign could begin under a protective dome. Israeli troops advancing into Sinai would not have to look up in fear of enemy bombers. The Jerusalem Brigade, moving through the Old City, would operate without the threat of airstrikes. The armored divisions preparing to climb the Golan Heights knew that no MiG would descend from above to halt them. The world watched in disbelief. In a single day, Israel had flipped the balance of the battlefield. Egypt's pride, the crown jewel of its Soviet-backed military, was in ruins. Syria's dreams of conquest dimmed. Jordan's involvement, spurred by Egyptian misinformation and pan-Arab solidarity, had become a strategic disaster. The skies, once crowded with the potential for Israeli defeat, now echoed only with the roar of Israeli jets flying unchallenged. Yet even amid this tactical triumph, the cost of survival weighed heavily. Every Israeli pilot had taken off that morning knowing the stakes. Failure meant not just death, but the destruction of their nation. Many flew 3 or 4 missions that day, returning to bases with empty fuel tanks and bullet-riddled fuselages, refueled by exhausted ground crews working with frantic devotion. There was no celebration, only grim relief. The war was far from over. But one thing was certain: Israel had seized the initiative. The first day of the 6-day war had seen the elimination of a regional air threat more formidable than any single army could have managed. Airfields were ash. Communications between Arab capitals were garbled and filled with panic. And a war that had been painted as Israel's last stand had suddenly become something else, entirely a prelude to counteroffensives, territorial gains, and decisions that would echo for generations. By midnight on June 5th, the course of history had veered off its expected path. Israel, once thought to be on the brink of annihilation, now controlled the skies. And in warfare, especially in the harsh, open terrain of the Middle East, whoever holds the skies holds the future. The sun had barely risen on June 6th when the dust of the Sinai began to tremble under the weight of Israeli tanks. The sky above was now uncontested. Israeli jets circled freely, scanning the dunes for targets and guiding troops with a god's-eye view of the battlefield. On the ground, columns of armor moved not in hesitation, but with purpose. What had started the day before as a preemptive airstrike had now become a full-scale ground invasion into one of the most fortified deserts in the world, and the Israeli Defense Forces were already rewriting the rules of desert warfare. The Egyptian army had never expected such a rapid assault. Spread out in rigid Soviet-style formations, its forward divisions were anchored to fixed positions, believing that Israel, if it attacked at all, would be worn down in a slow war of attrition. Instead, The IDF had no intention of playing by those rules. It sought to break through, not grind forward, to maneuver, not entrench. Using precise intelligence from aerial reconnaissance and covert listening posts, Israeli commanders identified weak point stretches between Egyptian divisions, where communication faltered, support was thin, and units operated in isolation. These were not just tactical gaps. They were opportunities wide enough for a brigade to slip through and deep enough for an entire campaign to hinge upon. The 7th Armored Brigade, under the command of Colonel Shmuel Golan, became the spearhead. Moving with an urgency that shocked even veteran commanders, Golan's tanks surged into the Sinai's central sector, bypassing major Egyptian strongholds and threading through the open desert like water through cracks in stone. Egyptian outposts, once confident in their layered defense, found themselves encircled before they could even raise an alarm. Israeli units struck with such speed and surprise that many Egyptian battalions surrendered without firing a shot, their supply lines cut, their radios silent, and their command posts abandoned. And while the tanks led the charge, the Israeli Air Force continued its relentless campaign above. Every Egyptian convoy spotted from the air was bombed. Every attempt to regroup or counterattack was intercepted and neutralized. Roads choked with fleeing vehicles, tanks ran dry without fuel, and trucks carrying ammunition exploded under precision rocket fire. The desert became a labyrinth of wreckage, scattered uniforms, and broken morale. But what truly defined the Israeli advance was not just firepower, it was coordination. Units operating dozens of kilometers apart moved as if guided by a single mind. Orders flowed quickly, logistics kept pace, and the famed Israeli doctrine of combined arms infantry, armor, and air support, operating as one was realized to devastating effect. Meanwhile, Egyptian command structures disintegrated. Conflicting reports, communication, blackouts, and overconfidence from Cairo sowed chaos. Generals issued contradictory orders. Some told their units to stand and fight, others to fall back. In the end, many soldiers did neither. They simply vanished into the sand. By June 7th, Israeli forces had reached the Mitla and Gidi Pass's strategic choke points deep within the Sinai that controlled the road to the Suez Canal. Rather than stop and consolidate, Israeli commanders pushed on. They had studied these routes for years, run war games, mapped every contour. This was not reckless ambition. It was execution. As the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies attempted to regroup near the canal, they found their rear threatened, their flanks exposed, and their hopes of reinforcement slipping into the sea. In the south, the Israeli 38th Paratrooper Brigade executed a daring maneuver. Flown by helicopters deep behind Egyptian lines, they seized the key outpost of Ras Sudar on the Gulf of Suez, cutting off the coastal road and preventing any retreat toward Cairo. Panic swept through the Egyptian rear echelons. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles, tossed weapons into sand dunes, and fled across the desert. The once proud army that had boasted of crushing Israel was now in full retreat, leaving behind its tanks, artillery, and illusions. In just 4 days, Israel had done what no military strategist believed possible. It had captured the entire Sinai Peninsula, over 60,000 square kilometers of hostile desert, crisscrossed with minefields and manned by one of the largest Arab armies, had fallen with astonishing speed. The IDF stood on the banks of the Suez Canal, staring westward toward Egypt's heartland, while behind them in the conquered sands sat mountains of abandoned Soviet-made hardware. Yet this triumph was not without cost. Israeli soldiers fought in suffocating heat, through blowing sand, and against entrenched enemies. There were ambushes, deadly minefields, and moments where it seemed momentum might falter. But they adapted, improvised, and endured. What gave them the edge was not just planning or weapons. It was clarity. They knew the stakes. They knew that survival was not a long-term strategy. It had to be achieved now, in days, before the world intervened or the tide could turn. Internationally, the speed of Israel's advance shocked both allies and enemies. The United Nations called for an immediate ceasefire while Arab capitals were stunned into silence. Cairo's propaganda broadcasts, once filled with boasts of Israeli defeat, were suddenly replaced by somber music and static. The myth of Arab invincibility had crumbled beneath Israeli tracks. But even as the IDF celebrated its advance to the canal, the war was far from over. To the north, Jordan had opened a new front around Jerusalem. In the northeast, Syrian artillery continued to shell Israeli farms from the high ridges of the Golan Heights. The Israeli High Command now faced a critical question: should they stop here, having secured the south, or should they press onward and confront the remaining threats still looming over their borders? The answer would shape the next phase of the war. The desert, silent once more, held the ruins of Egypt's shattered divisions. But for Israel, the echo of victory in Sinai was not the end. It was the foundation for what would come next. The battles for Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and a redefinition of the map of the Middle East. The roar of jets still echoed over Sinai when a new front erupted to the east. As Israeli armor secured the last roads to the Suez Canal, radio transmissions from Amman brought disturbing news. Jordanian artillery was shelling Israeli positions in West Jerusalem. The old city trembled under the barrage, and the sacred skyline was veiled in smoke and fire. For a moment it seemed irrational. Why would Jordan open a second front when Egypt's forces were in full retreat? The answer, tragically, was deception. King Hussein of Jordan had been assured by none other than Egypt's President Nasser that Cairo's forces were marching triumphantly into Israel, that Israeli cities lay in ruins, and that the war was all but won. Cairo Radio, the mouthpiece of Egyptian propaganda, broadcast victories that never happened, boasting of downed Israeli planes and captured towns. These were not just lies. They were strategic illusions, designed to pull Jordan into a war it was not prepared to fight. And it worked. Hussein, torn between caution and a desire to stand with his Arab allies, made a fateful decision. On June 5th, just hours after Israel had obliterated Egypt's air force in Operation Focus, Jordanian guns opened fire. The shells slammed into Israeli-held West Jerusalem, striking civilian neighborhoods, the Hebrew University, and even the Knesset. Snipers took up positions in the hills above, and Jordanian forces moved to cut the city in two. Israeli patience snapped. The war, which had begun with a surgical airstrike, now turned toward the heart of biblical history. The Israeli High Command did not want war with Jordan. They had sent messages urging Hussein to stay out, warning that Israel had no interest in opening another front. But now, with shells falling on Jewish neighborhoods and Jordanian forces threatening the narrow corridor connecting Jerusalem to the rest of Israel, they had no choice. Israel would strike, but not just to defend. They would reclaim what had been lost in 1948. In the shadow of Mount Scopus, paratroopers of the 55th Brigade, led by Mordecai Mata Gur, were ordered to prepare for urban combat. These were men hardened by past battles, many of them veterans of Israel's founding war. Now, they would fight to reunify Jerusalem. The battle would be bloody, not just for the weapons used, but for the sacred ground it consumed. Every street in East Jerusalem carried centuries of memory. Every stone seemed to bleed with history. But the paratroopers did not hesitate. On June 6th, as the sun set over the Mount of Olives, they began to move. 2 battalions climbed the ridgeline above the Augusta Victoria Hospital, advancing along the spine of the Mount of Olives and descending into the Kidron Valley. A 3rd battalion, led by Colonel Uri Banari, moved through the Lion's Gate, also known as St. Stephen's Gate, and entered the narrow alleys of the old city itself. The resistance was fierce. Jordanian soldiers, entrenched in centuries-old buildings, used every alley and rooftop to delay the advance. But the Israelis had momentum, superior coordination, and air superiority. By 10:00 a.m. on June 7th, the fighting inside the old city had ceased. Maudeguer's voice crackled over the radio with words that would echo through history. "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jerusalem whole and undivided was under Jewish control. Soldiers wept at the Western Wall. Some touched the ancient stones with trembling hands. Others sang. Even in war, especially in war, there are moments that rise above strategy and victory. This was one. But Jerusalem was only the beginning. As the capital was secured, Israeli forces pushed beyond. The momentum that had begun in the desert now rolled across the hills of Judea and Samaria. The Jerusalem Brigade swept south toward Bethlehem and Hebron, towns layered with both danger and prophecy. Meanwhile, the 10th Armored Brigade under Colonel Ben-Ari moved north through the Jordan Valley, cutting deep into Jordanian positions. Within 3 days, Israeli troops had captured the entire West Bank, an area larger than all of pre-war Israel. Jordanian resistance, once believed formidable, collapsed under the shock of coordinated Israeli attacks and the demoralizing realization that Egypt's promised victories were nothing but smoke. King Hussein, now isolated and reeling from the loss of half his kingdom's populated territory, agreed to a ceasefire on the evening of June 7th. 6,000 Jordanian soldiers were killed or missing. Israel had lost 550 across all fronts by this point. The contrast was staggering. But for all the tactical brilliance on display, the strategic consequences were just beginning to unfold. For Israel, the capture of East Jerusalem and the West Bank was more than just a military victory. It was a return to a homeland of memory. In Hebron, Jewish soldiers walked streets where their ancestors had lived for centuries. In Bethlehem, they saw the birthplace of ancient kings. In Nablus, once known as Shechem, they touched the bones of biblical forefathers. But this was not just spiritual, it was deeply political. The West Bank contained hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs. What would become of them? What rights, if any, would they have under Israeli rule? Would the land be held as a bargaining chip for peace or claimed as part of historic Israel? The questions would not be answered quickly. Some Israelis, emboldened by divine timing, saw the hand of providence in the victory and called for immediate settlement. Others, cautious and haunted by the price of occupation, warned that holding this territory would bring decades of unrest and global condemnation. Both were right, in their own ways. Back in Jerusalem, while flags flew and tears fell at the Western Wall, a new phase of the war was already underway. To the north, Syrian artillery still rained shells down from the looming heights of the Golan Plateau. Israel had defeated Egypt in 4 days, Jordan in 3, but Syria was next. The high ridges that towered over Galilee had become a symbol of unresolved threat, and the Israeli cabinet now faced the choice, hold or strike once more. But before that decision would be made, the world took note. In just 6 days, Israel had shattered the armies of 3 neighboring states, secured its capital, and redrawn the map of the Middle East. The war had begun with fear of annihilation, of encirclement, but now it left the region trembling for entirely different reasons. Power had shifted, lines had moved, and history had turned, and it had done so in less than a week. The road to the old city of Jerusalem was paved not just with ancient stones, but with fire, blood, and sacrifice. And nowhere was that more evident than at Ammunition Hill, a desolate rise on the city's edge, dotted with bunkers, trenches, and a deadly silence that would soon erupt into one of the fiercest urban battles of the Six-Day War. It was the night of June 5, 1967. While Israel's Air Force dominated the skies and the Sinai was crumbling under the weight of Israeli armor, Jerusalem remained in peril. Jordanian forces held the high ground, the strategic ridges that overlooked the roads into East Jerusalem, and chief among them was Ammunition Hill, a British Arab police post turned Jordanian fortress, bristling with reinforced bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. If Israel wanted to break the siege of West Jerusalem and move toward reunification of the city, Ammunition Hill had to fall. There was no alternative. The task fell to the paratroopers of the 3rd Company, 66 battalion young men in their 20s, some barely out of high school, trained for speed, precision, and aggression. These were not hardened veterans. They were citizen soldiers thrown into a brutal crucible of modern warfare amidst biblical geography. Under cover of darkness, they moved out, hearts pounding beneath olive green fatigues, not knowing that within hours, many of them would lie still on the rocky slopes of that forsaken hill. The assault began at 2:30 in the morning, with a brief artillery barrage too brief, many would later say. It pounded the surface, but did little to damage the deep bunkers dug into the hillside. When the shells stopped, silence returned, then a sudden burst of machine gun fire. The paratroopers surged forward, moving through a narrow trench system, so tight and winding that it forced them into single file. It was close-quarter combat in the worst possible conditions, darkness, confusion, and no room to maneuver. Grenades exploded at their feet. Jordanian snipers picked off men from hidden slits in reinforced walls. Every meter of ground cost blood. There was no room for retreat. The trenches were a maze, and turning back meant death. So they pressed forward, throwing grenades, clearing bunkers, dragging wounded comrades behind them. The noise was deafening. The screams of the wounded mixed with the sharp commands of officers urging their men onward. At times, the fighting came down to fists, bayonets, even rocks. Every corner concealed death. But the paratroopers did not stop. Captain Rami Zahavi, leading one of the assault teams, was among the first to fall. As he charged a bunker, he was hit multiple times but kept moving forward until he collapsed at the enemy's doorstep. Others picked up where he left off. Leadership on Ammunition Hill passed hand to hand as officer after officer was cut down, yet the mission never faltered. By dawn, after 4 hours of relentless grinding combat, the final Jordanian position on the hill fell. The Israeli flag was raised over the shattered outpost. 36 Israeli paratroopers had died. Over 70 Jordanian soldiers had been killed defending the position. And although the hill was secured, there was no celebration, only the exhausted silence of survivors walking through trenches littered with the fallen. But Ammunition Hill was more than just a battlefield. It was the key. With it captured, the route to Mount Scopus and the Old City lay open. The following day, Israeli forces pushed through the Lion's Gate, crossed into the ancient alleys of the Old City, and reached the Western Wall. Maudeger's voice, trembling with emotion, broadcast to the nation, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." Still, it is important to understand what that moment cost. The unification of Jerusalem was not the result of a smooth political decision or a clever diplomatic move. It was bought with the lives of young men who fought in darkness, in confusion, against well-entrenched defenders on ground that gave every advantage to the enemy. It was won trench by trench, room by room, breath by breath. Ammunition Hill became a symbol not just of tactical victory, but of the spirit of a nation that refused to be divided. For nearly 2 decades, East and West Jerusalem had been split by barbed wire, landmines, and snipers. Families could not cross to visit graves. Pilgrims could not pray at sacred sites. And in the middle of it all, a city that had always been a symbol of unity was cleaved in two. In retaking Ammunition Hill, in clearing that one stretch of high ground, Israeli forces did more than secure a military objective. They began the process of stitching Jerusalem back together. But reunification brought with it profound complexities. The Old City was home to Muslim, Christian, and Jewish holy sites. The population was deeply Arab. And now, for the first time in modern history, it was under full Israeli control. What would it mean for coexistence? What would sovereignty look like in a city sacred to half the world? Those questions still echo. But in June 1967, there was no time to dwell. After Ammunition Hill, after the Old City, the war surged onward. To the north, Syrian artillery still rained down on Israeli farms from the Golan Heights. The paratroopers who had bled in Jerusalem now turned their eyes toward the mountains, ready to climb once more. And in the hearts of a generation of Israelis, the trenches of Ammunition Hill would never be forgotten. It was not the largest battle of the war, nor the most strategically significant in terms of territory gained, but it was, in many ways, the soul of the war. It was where young men fought, not for conquest, but for a city, for memory, for a promise buried deep in stone. It was where Jerusalem, torn and bleeding, was made whole again. The sun rose slowly over the Galilee, casting long shadows across the farms and orchards of northern Israel. For years, those very shadows had concealed a threat, a looming presence that dominated the horizon, the Golan Heights. From this massive basalt plateau, Syrian artillery could peer down directly into Israeli towns, with nothing but open air between them and their targets. The border was not a barrier, it was an invitation to fire. For over a decade, Syrian shells had fallen on kibbutzim, on tractors in open fields, on schoolyards. Children grew up learning the sound of incoming fire. Farmers tilled their soil beneath the constant threat of distant eyes and ready guns. The war may have been raging in the Sinai and Jerusalem, but in the north, fear was already part of daily life. On June 8, 1967, that fear turned into fire. Even as Egypt and Jordan accepted ceasefires, Syria refused to stand down. Their artillery intensified, pounding Israeli settlements along the northern frontier. The war had begun without a formal declaration, and it would not end with quiet negotiations. Damascus insisted that it still had the upper hand, but Israel had had enough. It was not just about territory anymore, it was about security, and silencing the guns that had shadowed an entire generation. The Israeli cabinet hesitated at first. Attacking the Golan was no small feat. The terrain was brutal, jagged ravines, steep cliffs, and narrow paths cut through rock that rose 2,000 feet above the Sea of Galilee. The Syrians had spent years turning it into a fortress. Concrete bunkers dotted the ridges, minefields blanketed the approaches, deep trenches laced the high ground, and every access route was zeroed in by artillery. It was a defender's paradise, and Israel would have to go uphill, exposed, into the teeth of Syrian fire. But the people of the north demanded action. Kibbutzniks who had buried their children wanted the shelling to stop permanently. So on June 9th, the decision was made. Israel would take the Golan Heights, no matter the cost. The offensive was launched with lightning speed and calculated precision. The Israeli Air Force had been bombing Syrian positions for 2 days, softening the defenses. Now, 2 divisional task groups surged forward. One, under Brigadier General Don Lehner, moved in from the north, bringing with him the elite Golani Brigade veterans of brutal combat in Jerusalem. The second task group, composed of battle-worn units, fresh from the fight in the West Bank, climbed from the southern Galilee, aiming straight at the center of the plateau. The first assaults were met with unrelenting resistance. The Syrian defenders, well entrenched and highly motivated, unleashed a storm of fire. Artillery rained down, and machine guns lit up the slopes. Israeli tanks struggled to maneuver on narrow roads flanked by cliffs. Infantry units had to dismount and fight their way forward bunker by bunker. The advance was measured in meters. Every step cost lives. At Telephone Fair, a critical Syrian outpost, the battle descended into chaos. The Golani soldiers charged uphill, crawling under barbed wire, clearing bunkers with grenades, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat inside trench networks. One platoon was reduced to 3 men before reinforcements arrived. Another soldier threw himself across a barbed wire barricade to form a human bridge for his comrades. There was no retreat. The hill had to fall, and it did. By dusk on June 9th, Telephone Fair was in Israeli hands. The northern edge of the Golan Heights had cracked. Meanwhile, in the south, A different kind of battle was underway. Elements of Israel's 10th Brigade, led by Colonel Albert Mandler, had been ordered to redeploy from Jerusalem to the Golan in less than 24 hours. Under normal circumstances, this would be a logistical nightmare. Roads were choked with traffic, fuel was limited, and military police clogged intersections. But the Israeli soldiers were told one thing: be at the coordinates by 4 a.m. No excuses. And they were. The entire brigade moved across the country through the night, arriving before dawn, ready for combat. It was a testament not only to discipline, but to the Israeli army's ability to function in the chaos of war without falling apart. Where other forces demanded order, Israel thrived in the storm. By the morning of June 10th, Israeli forces had reached deep into the heart of the Golan. The Syrian command, sensing collapse, began pulling back its reserves. Brigade after brigade was withdrawn toward Damascus. Syrian generals were no longer fighting for the Golan, they were fighting to preserve their army. The plateau, so heavily fortified, was unraveling. That afternoon, a final Israeli assault was launched from the south, leapfrogging across steep canyons and ravines. The Syrian line broke. Command posts were abandoned. Equipment was left behind. The once impregnable Golan Heights fell not in weeks or even days, but in less than 36 hours. That night, Syria finally agreed to a ceasefire. The war was over. But the battlefield remained. 2,500 Syrian soldiers had died, with thousands more wounded or captured. Israel had lost 127 men in the Golan campaign alone. But what they had gained was more than land. It was silence. The guns that once echoed across the Galilee fell quiet. Israeli children could sleep without fear. Farmers could plow without flinching. For the first time in its history, Israel had depth, strategic high ground that could not be easily reclaimed by force. Yet with victory came complexity. Israel now controlled the Golan Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula. These were not just tactical assets, they were political powder kegs. Inside Israel, debates erupted. Should these lands be traded for peace? Should they be annexed? What are the Palestinians now under Israeli rule? And what would the world say? But those questions would come later. For now there was only dust and silence, and the high wind that blew across the Golan's black volcanic rock. The war had lasted 6 days. The consequences would echo for generations. When the dust of the 6-day war finally settled, Israel found itself standing on a different map than it had just a week earlier. The battlefield victories had been swift, staggering, and total. In just 6 days, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. It now controlled vast territories that extended its borders by hundreds of miles. For a nation that had once been just a narrow sliver of land, constantly fearing its own extinction, these new frontiers offered something it had never known before: strategic depth. For the first time in its existence, Israel was not gasping for space. It had room to maneuver militarily, buffer zones against future attacks, and critical high ground to observe and defend. The Sinai Peninsula, with its vast, empty deserts, became a massive barrier between Israel and the Egyptian heartland. The Golan Heights, towering above the Galilee, no longer loomed as a Syrian artillery platform, but now served as Israel's shield, and Jerusalem, the spiritual and historical soul of the Jewish people, was no longer divided. The Old City, the Western Wall, and the Temple Mount were now in Israeli hands. But every gain came with a cost, and not just in blood or tanks or ammunition. The cost came in the form of a question that lingered over every square kilometer of captured land. What now? The strategic buffers were clear. With control over Sinai, Israel could secure the southern border and protect Eilat, its only access point to the Red Sea. The Golan meant peace, or at least silence, for the farmers in the north. The West Bank provided high ground overlooking Israel's coastal plain, where most of its population lived. But the West Bank also came with nearly 1 million Palestinians. Gaza added hundreds of thousands more. These were not empty battlegrounds. They were homes, towns, and cities filled with people who had no desire to live under Israeli rule. Internationally, the situation was even more complex. The United Nations, within days of the ceasefire, passed Resolution 242. It called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories occupied in the conflict in exchange for peace and recognition by Arab states. But the resolution's language was deliberately vague. Did territories mean all of them? Some of them? Who would move first, Israel or its neighbors? Inside Israel, the euphoria of victory was quickly tempered by heated debate. There were those who saw the West Bank not as occupied land, but as Judea and Samaria, the ancient heartland of the Jewish people. They argued that the land was not only strategically vital, but also historically and biblically destined to be part of Israel. Others warned of the demographic and moral quagmire that came with ruling over a large, unwilling Palestinian population. The settlements that began to rise in the West Bank and Golan Heights were hailed by some as patriotic and condemned by others as reckless. The captured territories became not only a military asset, but also a political minefield. Egypt demanded the return of Sinai as a precondition for peace. Syria insisted. The Golan was non-negotiable. Jordan quietly mourned its loss of the West Bank, but also distanced itself from the emerging Palestinian national movement, which now began to gain momentum as Palestinians realized that no one else would restore their homeland for them. And so even as the borders had expanded, the dilemmas had deepened. The Six-Day War had changed the terrain of Israel's enemies, but it had also changed the terrain of Israel's own identity. Was it a state that would hold land for security, or a state that would trade land for peace? Was it a military victor with a temporary grip on territory, or a new regional power destined to reshape the map of the Middle East permanently? By the 1970s, these questions would erupt into a new war, new peace negotiations, and new political fault lines within Israeli society itself. But in the summer of 1967, all that lay ahead. For now, the soldiers returned home, the crowds danced in the streets of Jerusalem, and Israeli leaders looked out across a dramatically widened landscape and into a future that no one could yet fully understand. The victory had been total, but the consequences would be enduring. What had been gained was not just land or leverage, but the burden of decision, of power, and of control over millions of people who did not choose it. For a state born in struggle, this was the moment it had dreamed of, and the beginning of challenges it had never imagined. Victory, it turned out, was only the beginning. In the decades that followed the Six-Day War, Israel's stunning military triumph remained unmatched in its speed, precision, and geopolitical consequences. It had defeated 3 Arab armies, gained territories triple its original size, and momentarily secured a sense of safety it had never known. Yet as the smoke cleared and the cheers faded, the complexity of holding land and holding peace settled in, like a new kind of siege. The Sinai Peninsula, vast and desolate, became the first test of what this victory truly meant. Israel had paid dearly in blood to conquer it, and yet just over a decade later, under intense international and regional pressure, it made a monumental choice. In 1979, Israel returned the Sinai to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty, the first between Israel and an Arab state. The Egyptian-Israeli peace accord, brokered at Camp David, was hailed as a turning point. For the first time, one of Israel's fiercest enemies had chosen diplomacy over war. The Sinai became more than sand and rock. It became a symbol of what Israel might be willing to sacrifice for the promise of lasting peace. But not all frontiers were so easily resolved. To the east, the West Bank remained a tangled web of military necessity, historical identity, and demographic reality. Captured from Jordan, this region held profound religious significance for many Israelis. It was, to them, not just strategic ground, it was the cradle of Jewish history. Settlements multiplied, and so did tensions. The Palestinian population living under occupation became a permanent challenge to Israeli democracy and international diplomacy. Intifadas, Palestinian uprisings would erupt, pushing the region to the brink again and again. The dream of a secure Israel became entwined with the unresolved question of Palestinian statehood, with peace slipping further out of reach. Each time violence flared. In the north, the Golan Heights remained equally contentious. Though less populated, the plateau's strategic significance was undeniable. Israel had seized it at great cost, its soldiers scaling cliffs under fire, sacrificing lives to silence the Syrian guns that once rained shells on farms in the Galilee. After the war, settlements followed, and in 1981, Israel formally annexed the territory, a move never internationally recognized. For the Syrian regime, the loss of Golan was a national wound. For Israel, it was a non-negotiable line of defense. The Golan, like the West Bank, became a frozen front in a conflict that refused to fully end. Only Jordan, eventually, would follow Egypt's path. In 1994, Israel and Jordan signed a formal peace treaty, opening borders, embassies, and dialogue. It was a significant step, yet fraught with fragility. While official relations were established, the Jordanian street remained deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. The peace was cold, real, but brittle, and through it all, Israel's victory in 1967 loomed like a shadow. It had won the war, yes, but had it won peace? That question lingered with each passing decade. The expanded borders gave Israel new strength, but also new vulnerabilities. The sense of security gained in 6 days began to erode under the weight of decades of unresolved conflict, global pressure, and internal division. A generation that had fought for survival now faced the challenge of moral responsibility, demographic dilemmas, and the limits of military power in achieving political solutions. For many Israelis, the 6-day war marked both a miracle and a burden. It had unified Jerusalem, protected the northern villages, opened access to sacred sites, but it had also entangled the state in questions it is yet to answer. How can it remain both a Jewish and democratic state while ruling over millions of non-citizens? How can it secure peace without surrendering territory? And can it ever truly feel safe in a region that still bears the scars of that brief, explosive week in June 1967? Today, the legacy of the 6-day war remains etched into every border and every negotiation. It is a story of lightning-fast conquest and painfully slow reconciliation. It is a story that reminds us that military victories, however total, do not end history. They complicate it. So as you reflect on this chapter of the Middle East, ask yourself, was the 6-day war the end of a struggle for survival, or the beginning of a new, far more complex war for the soul of a nation? If this story has helped you see this conflict in a deeper light, please like this video, share it with others who want to understand the real history behind the headlines, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the hidden layers of our world. Together, we can go beyond the surface and bring context back to history.